Hi, I'm Kim Peets and welcome to My Story, His Story. What do we know about Seventh-day Adventist church leaders and how has God influenced them? In this series we take a closer look at the lives of these Christian leaders and invite them to share some of their stories with us. Here with me I have Pastor Carole Ferch-Johnson. Hi Carole.
Hi Kim.
Welcome.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here today.
Nice to be here.
Your work roles have involved working with women's ministries and also in prayer ministries. And yet life wasn't always going to be like that for you, was it? It's taken quite a turn.
That's right. Actually, my life started out quite differently. I was born into and grew up in a family of non-church goers, to begin with, that is. But when I was a child, the neighborhood children started to attend children's meetings that were Bible-based. And I thought I'd go along too, particularly because the other children told me that if you could answer the questions they asked, then you could win a prize. And
that's quite an incentive when you're of young age.
Yes, that's right. So I went along and I discovered that there were assignments that we needed to memorize Bible texts. And they chose for us 26 Bible texts, and each one of those began with a different letter of the alphabet. And so we could memorize them right through the alphabet, and at the end, if we could say them all without a stop, then we got a prize.
Oh,
so of course I did this. More than once.
And did you become quite prolific in Bible verses?
Well, look, I did become very familiar with particularly New Testament Bible verses, because that's where they started us. And in fact, they're the ones I best remember today, which I guess is quite amazing. Ask and it will be given you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door shall be opened unto you. That's A, right? B, be not overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. So they come very readily to mind.
And you still remember it, just like. Oh,
indeed.
That's great. That's great. And some of the prizes were quite good, and I think they changed your life in a lot of ways.
Yes, that's right. There were, of course, erasers and pencils and pencil sharpeners and those kinds of things that children love to get. But if you did really well, they would give you a book. And I can remember winning a few books, but one of them really affected me. It really was a life-changing book. And that was the story of Mary Jones, the Welsh girl who walked across Wales barefoot in order to be able to get a Bible. And I thought, wow, if the Bible is such an important book for her, and if it's such a treasure to have, and I've got one at home, well, maybe I ought to read it a bit more. And so in learning these memory verses and also in reading the Bible, I, of course, began to undergo a life change, because the Word of God always changes you when you expose yourself to it.
That's so true. And from that led a conversion for your whole family, didn't it?
Well, in fact, yes, because I was going to those meetings, I then started to go to church regularly. And I came home one day and I said to my parents, how come everybody else's mommy and daddy goes to church and you don't? And that was rather confronting for them, and they stopped and thought about it. And the next week they came with me. And from then on, we always went together.
That's amazing. That's fantastic. And then life took another turn for you. You moved to Australia.
Yes, indeed. And that was quite a crisis, actually.
Would have been. How old were you when you moved?
Yeah, I was 15 years of age. So really, it wasn't a very good time to move. It wasn't a good time socially. It wasn't a good time developmentally. And yet, I think that God's hand was in it. Because although I came across some experiences that were difficult for me educationally, I mean, I just didn't fit in anywhere. I thought it would be easy. Leave one high school, go to the next. What's the problem? Yeah. But the curriculum was different. The young people were at a different stage in their in relationship to several of the subjects to what I was, and so I find that very hard, very difficult. Socially, it was hard because where I had grown up in Northern Ireland, very religious country, I didn't know anybody there that I can think of that wasn't at least affiliated with some church. When I came to Australia, of course, I find that very different. And also I think the fact that in Ireland we were girls for a lot of years, from 12 to 17, just girls doing girl things together. Right. When I arrived here, I find that girls, by the time they were 15, 16, already had boyfriends, and that was quite a revelation.
That would have been very tricky. And what about your schooling? How did that go? Like you know, from one state to another in Australia is quite different, but going from one country to another must have been incredibly.
Yes. Well, as I've said, the curriculum was quite different, and so fitting into the new one was not easy.
Oh, I can just imagine. And you had some other challenges too.
Yes.
Share some of those stories.
Yes, I did. Well, I actually was born with a genetically transmitted condition, which has made me legally blind. And unfortunately, no lenses will correct that. So I just have to make my way through life not seeing very well. And when I reached my teen years, around about the time we migrated to Australia, the full impact of what that was going to mean for me and for my life really dawned on me. I can remember when I was 16, my dad said to me, well, it's time now to teach you to drive. But of course, with my eyesight, I could never be given a license.
And that's very hard as a teenager, not being able to get yourself about.
That's right. And then career prospects. What was I going to do with my life? The eye specialist had told my parents that perhaps I could be a milk delivery lady or a bread delivery lady. I could run up to the house from the truck and deliver the milk or deliver the bread to people's houses, because that delivery service used to be available back in those days. It didn't really appeal to me, I must say. I had thought it would be nice to be a doctor, but I didn't have the vision for that.
Milkman.
You're right. I didn't have the eyesight for that. Maybe a school teacher, no. You couldn't entrust children to a person who couldn't see very well, so I couldn't do that. So it really was difficult to work out what I do with my life. And it was at that point in time that I came in contact with Seventh-day Adventists and what they teach. And my parents, and my dad in particular, who was always interested in new ideas, suggested that we go along and listen to a series of presentations, of lectures, as they were advertised, by what turned out to be a Seventh-day Adventist evangelist, whose name was George Burnside. So we went along to his meetings, and we were amazed at what the Bible actually taught. We didn't know all of that. And so, bit by bit, we decided that we too would become Seventh-day Adventists, so we did.
That's amazing.
And that really helped me at that time in my life. I began to see that life wasn't just something you make for yourself, but life was under God's guidance, under His direction, and that He would be able to lead me and to help me. And so I gave my life fully to God. I can remember kneeling in an Anglican church one lunchtime in the city of Perth and saying, well, Lord, I want to be 100% yours. I don't know what that means, but I really want to be nothing else but yours. Do with me what you want. And so God did lead my life from that point on.
Thank you so much, Carole. After this break, we'll hear more stories from Carole Ferch-Johnson. Welcome back to My Story, His Story. I'm talking with Pastor Carole Ferch-Johnson. Carole, I've really enjoyed listening to your upbringing and hearing about you joining the Seventh-day Adventist Church and how you brought your family to the church. It's amazing. And also you've talked about some of your challenges. As a teenager, you moved to Australia from Northern Ireland, and you've also had to struggle with being legally blind, and there's been all sorts of challenges that have come your way. What happened next?
Well, I guess I grew up, and as most women do, I married. I married Arthur Ferch, who was also an immigrant from Germany, and he was a pastor. And as time went by, of course, we had 2 sons. And then Arthur's career took off, and he became a specialist in Old Testament studies. And that led him to work for the Seventh-day Adventist Church in a broader way. And so he traveled a lot. And by the time we got to our late 40s, Arthur was traveling in the South Pacific region, visiting several Pacific islands. And on one occasion, well, the last occasion actually, he went to the island of Samoa. And unfortunately, he tragically met with his death there in a car accident.
What happened?
Well, he had been upgrading the education of pastors, which he did throughout the South Pacific region, and he just finished a series of lectures and was going with one of the students to visit an area in Samoa that was of particular interest. And they didn't have a lot of time, and so they had to go quickly. And they came across a section of road that hadn't been properly sealed, and there hadn't been any sign put up on it as there should have been. And so they sank down into quite deep volcanic gravel, and the car was thrown and it rolled several times. Arthur was sitting in the back. It was a utility. He was sitting in the back with a student, a theology student from Fiji, and they were thrown out, and Arthur was killed instantly. It was a big shock for us because, you know, up to that point in time, we'd always believed in our immortality. Nothing bad can happen to us. And of course, we had a little bit of a simplistic belief. If you love God and you work for Him, then bad things won't happen to you, which of course was not realistic, as this and other people's experiences proved.
And that must have really challenged your relationship with God.
Well, you would think so, but I'd really come to terms with things not going altogether ideally in your life because of my eyesight. And I thought, well, God works with difficult circumstances. He doesn't banish them in order for you to be able to have a life free from problems. But he helps you, He works with you in them. And these things grow us if we allow them to. They enrich us if we allow them to. I don't believe that God sends them so that they will grow us or that they will enrich us. But because they're a part of this world in which we live, then if we allow Him, He can use them to help us to understand better. And I think ultimately to be able to serve and to minister better. I think that's where it certainly is where it has led in my life.
And so where did it lead you from there?
Yes, from there, at that time that happened, I was working as a chaplain of all things in a hospital and dealing with death and dying all the time anyway. But shortly after that, I was invited by the Seventh-day Adventist Church to become a leader in the whole of the South Pacific area for women.
That is quite a large role. And if I recall, it was probably the first of its kind.
Yes, it was.
That would have been very exciting.
It was. It took me to all of the islands, and it took me all around Australia and New Zealand. And it was something new for the Seventh-day Adventist Church at the time, and we're talking now back in the late 80s, 1990, around there, when we started this ministry here. But it has been great to see women catching on to what it's about, that it is a ministry to them, and not just an encouragement of them to work harder. I think women work very hard, and they work very hard for any church. They work hard for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So I don't think women need to be told, now you need to do more. But I think they need to be ministered to. I think that they need to be spiritually fed, probably by other women as well as men. And I think they also need to know that what they're doing is acknowledged as a very worthwhile contribution. And sometimes there are areas that they can grow into that they didn't think they could do. That's where the growth comes into it.
And you had a bit of personal experience because when your husband died, you went through a bit of an identity crisis.
Oh, yes.
And I know that you would be able to help other women in the same way.
Yes, I hadn't expected that. I hadn't expected that when my husband died, I would no longer, one, be a pastor's wife. What would I be? My whole life was just revolved around working as a pastor's wife, supporting my husband and dealing with people in a ministry sense. So who was I now and what was I going to be? It was an identity crisis. I really had to review what my present and future were now going to be.
And how did you cope with that?
Well, the first realization that came to me was that I was now a widow. Oh, I disliked that word. It didn't seem to fit. I'd always been a married person, and being a widow just seemed strange. And I wasn't doing terribly well either in absorbing much from the Word of God. You know, that's a cognitive activity, and my emotions were churned up, so I wasn't really getting in touch too well with the Bible. But friends were praying for me, and I really relied and lent on that. I was very fortunate that I did have friends who prayed for me. And then I began to read the Bible again, and I opened up to the book of Psalms on one occasion and found Psalm 146, in which the Lord says that He cares for the widows and for the orphans in their distress. And somehow the text just touched me. I said to Him, Lord, that's me right now. That's me today. I need your help, and I am in distress. Until I find my feet and know where I'm going and know what my life's going to be, I really need special direction and help. And I believe the Lord gave that to me at that time.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. And it's funny. I've heard story after story about people opening up the Bible and literally putting their finger on the text that just suited them at the time, and it sounded like that was just perfect for you.
Indeed.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Stay with us, and we'll have some more stories after this break. Welcome back to My Story, His Story. I've been talking with Pastor Carole Ferch-Johnson. Carole Ferch-Johnson, before the break you were talking about your husband Arthur Ferch, but there's now a Johnson on top of that.
Yes, quite right. I actually did remarry. I married Dr. Bill Johnson, who's a medical doctor, and that was a very wise thing to do.
You've married 2 doctors.
Yes, indeed.
Oh, very intelligent. Now, was that about the same time that you went into women's ministries?
Yes, actually, I married Bill just before I went into women's ministries, and I talked through the invitation with him, and he's very supportive of anything I do in ministry, so he was right behind my becoming women's ministries director for the South Pacific region, which of course entails a lot of travel. You've got to go visit the people in these island areas and also all around Australia, New Zealand.
Yes. Oh, it's an incredible work, and I'm very interested in hearing a little bit more about what you do, because your role has changed slightly now. Please share more about that.
Yes, certainly, happy to. Actually, I was more amazed than anybody that I was asked to be a leader, because, you know, I just didn't start out as that kind of person. I know my father had always encouraged me to be an upfront person and to do public speaking as he had done, but that was about all. I mean, I was never a school prefect, I wasn't a school captain, none of those things. Well, I didn't even make it into the first 11 of the hockey team for my school. And so I was really amazed when I was asked to do this. But I thought about it and I thought, well, I know that God leads us and God asks us, and He uses instrumentalities to do that. The church is simply an institution that God can use. And so I saw that He was inviting me into a leadership position that probably needed the kind of person I was at the time when we were starting this ministry, so I accepted it on that basis.
And what are some of the highlights of being in women's ministries?
Oh, the overwhelming thing is the ministry that the women did for me. It was just wonderful to move around and see their faith and to see how day by day and hour by hour they live with God. Their prayer life was vibrant, it was alive, their trust and dependence on God, their belief in His leading, and the lack of all those not so nice things that are a part of the feminine persona was very refreshing too. There was jealousy and one-upmanship and the kinds of things that women can get into. It's all missing. They just were so lovely that I was enriched by associating with them.
Okay. And more recently, your role involves supporting women in ministry.
Yes, that's right. But this is a more specialised kind of ministry. This is now women who are employed in pastoral ministry. So these are ministers of churches. And my role is to support them. And I do that through a number of avenues. We have a newsletter that I send out periodically. I also contact them by phone. I email them. I visit sometimes, particularly when there's a crisis, or sometimes just because they don't live very far from me and they've invited me to come preach in their church, something like that, so I will do that. But I find that helping them in the area of crises is probably the most productive thing I do for them. Sometimes they have usually it's gender issues. I mean, that's what my appointment is about, helping with gender issues. So where they have a gender issue in the congregation they're in, I will help there if I can. And also sometimes even, believe it or not, with the people who are employing them, there are gender issues that I also need to help them with.
And there's more and more female ministers in Seventh-day Adventist, in the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Yes, indeed. We have currently we have 23 who are employed as pastors in the country of Australia, and then of course we have some in New Zealand, in the Pacific area, in Papua New Guinea. All of those areas have got female pastors now. And it's a reasonably new phenomenon for us. We haven't been quick to bring women into pastoral ministry, despite the fact that, our early history involves the ministry of women in a very prominent role.
That's very true, very true. So would I be surprised to hear that a female biblical person would be your role model?
No, I think you probably would expect that, Kim.
Well, yes, I would.
Yes, but I'm going to be a little bit different from that, and I'm going to say that the person who is a role model for me is actually the Apostle Paul, the one who is said to be against women, but he isn't really.
Oh, isn't he?
No.
Well, tell us more about what inspires you about Paul.
Yes. Well, he was a very energetic person. He did a tremendous amount. He travelled over what is said to be the whole world of his era, the world that was known at the time.
Yes.
He just seemed to work unceasingly for God. And I think his vision of God was a spectacular thing. We say that Paul was a person of poor eyesight, and perhaps I can identify there.
Yes.
But also he was a person of excellent vision, and I would like to be able to identify there.
Definitely, definitely. He was quite an intelligent person and quite well read.
Yes, very well educated. He was fortunate in that his family could afford to send him from Tarsus, where he was born, at an early age, down to Jerusalem, where he could learn within his own tradition, which was the Jewish tradition, from great scholars that were recognized and acclaimed in his day. But his education wasn't just limited to Jewish exposure. He also had an understanding of the literary figures and the history and so of the surrounding area, so that when he, for instance, went to Greece, what we call Greece today, and he went to Athens, he appeared before the Areopagus there, which was the council that met on Mars Hill, and he was able to quote their own poets to them, and he was able to talk about wisdom, which he knew was very important to them. He could move right into their arena of thinking, and really it takes an education to be able to do that, and he had that ability. But a strange thing about Paul, despite the fact that education is always so important for people, he didn't count it as being of any value compared with Jesus. Jesus was the all-absorbing person for Paul. Yes. And so he said to the people, I have determined to know nothing among you except Christ and him crucified.
So he was quite the public evangelist,
indeed.
Wasn't he?
Yes, indeed, and you say that word. Actually, he was very interested in reaching as many people as he could. And he wasn't just interested in believers, in people who already had faith in God. He was interested too in people who were seeking, people who were trying to understand, is there a God, and is there a truth about God? And if there is a truth about God, what is it? Paul was very good at reaching these kind of people, and so he did that. And he had another string to his bow as well, and this one perhaps sits very well with me, and that was his tendency to good pastoral care. And I guess we know that from the Bible. There's a book in the Bible here, a little book of Titus, where Paul recommends to Titus the care of a runaway slave by the name of Onesimus. And I guess everybody had given up on Onesimus, fairly worthless sort of guy. But Paul says, I want you to look after him, I want you to care for him. Here was pastoral care. One person out of all the thousands that Paul had exposure to, but he had a heart for this one person. That's what a pastoral carer does, is somebody who has a heart for people. And Paul was like that. So I resonate with that. I like that about Paul.
And I guess you can understand because he had his own Damascus Road experience, as you did.
He did, yes. He had a Damascus Road experience, and people often say, oh, it was all right for Paul. He had a Damascus Road experience. But I think in a sense we all do. We all come to the point where suddenly the light switches on, and we can see God in a way that we haven't before, and we can be commissioned by Him, because the two always go together. Seeing God and being invited by Him to serve always go together. And so we can be commissioned by God to serve in whatever way He has equipped us and to whatever length He sends us to minister on His behalf.
Carole, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.